All right, so here I am on my shadow clipping mask, trying to carefully paint without making too many mistakes, darkening my local colors selectively. And there's no kind of rules to it. You could decide to leave some flat colors showing and not put shadows on everything, or you can decide to meticulously do darker tones for every flat color you've chosen, for every local color. And some people just leave it at that. They let their local colors be their kind of highlight duotone. And so between the light green and the dark green, you have kind of a full green. And then some people like to push duotone further. Just going to clean it up around the eyes here. Now this is cut edge duotone, which means it's very clean. I have a hard-edged brush. That means I have to be pretty exact with where I make my marks. But it can be very effective that way as well. And the clipping mask really helps. It keeps me from coloring in places where I shouldn't be able to. And that's why you really want to make sure you have your flat colors right. Okay, for shadows for the hair, let's see. That'll work. Okay, so why do we take the time to make our shadows on a separate layer? Well, it's so we can adjust them on that separate layer. So for instance, now that I have all my shadows here, that's the flat color, that's the shadow color. Remembering I want to have a shadow here as well. Let's do it with this. The great thing about the clipping mask on darken is you'll see how it will affect the colors that are similar in slightly different ways. So that kind of limeish green gets darkened with a slightly darker version of its light color. So that's a nice little benefit of using clipping masks here. Okay, so let's say we're done with that. I'm just having too much fun. What's another way I could go with my duotone shading? This was cut edge, and you can see the difference it makes. Let's turn that off. Let's make another shadow layer. So I'll call that one shadows cut edge, or hard edge, or cell shaded. Now this one I'm going to call shadows soft edge. And I'm going to set it the same way, set it to darken. But this time, instead of a hard brush, I'm going to use a really soft brush, a little bit larger. I could even try different opacities if I wanted to. And when I do the shadows this time, they're going to be much softer edged. Like gradients. Especially if I use a lower opacity, because it will blend with the color behind. So it's usually used on faces, especially for cheeks and things, to give just a faint impression of features. Now I've just duotoned the face, but look at the difference between cut edge here and soft edge. And there are lots of variations of soft edge. By using a lower opacity, I can kind of build it up a little bit more in value than I can with cut edge. But the soft edge makes it so the placement is a little more forgiving, except that I can accidentally affect more colors than I want to pretty quickly. So this is a more subtle way of adding shadows. And it just depends what suits your design. Remember, I can't ever go lighter because I have it set to darken. These little red shadows in the hair here. So you get a sense of what that works, how that works. And how different those are. And you can't say that one's better or worse than the other. They're just different types of duotone. Okay, so let's say I use that. Let's say I keep with the cut edge. Now I'm going to make a highlight one. So I make another layer above my flat colors, and I call it highlights, cut edge. I'm going to set this clipping mask to lighten. And I'm going to start with the hair. It's blonde hair. I want blonde highlights. Oh, I got to change my brush to a hard brush. And I decide how bright I want it. That's too bright, maybe like this. Now this is about as far as you can push duotone, by having the local color show and having a light version and having a shadow version. Most of the time people deal with highlights once they've done their shadows. They just deal with highlights by taking their flat color layer, making a duplicate of it, and then just playing with levels and brightening it. So that becomes their highlights. See how that works? And that works quite well. So to save time, that's what I'm going to do here. And not worry about this extra highlights layer. Okay, now to finish it off, what are the other now special effects you can do? Of course, you can do highlights with soft edge as well. And you can mix them up if you want. So if I wanted to use this highlights, I could mix between hard edge and soft edge. I can make it look like his sword is glowing a little bit or more reflective by adding some gradations on it. Right? I can give him slightly rosy cheeks with a very low opacity soft brush, kind of painting in a pinkness to his cheeks. It's very subtle. I can give a little glint to this leaf with a soft-edged, soft brush, and to the hat, and to his uniform in the highlights. So you can always mix and match. Basically, as long as you're coloring behind an outline, you are doing digital coloring, and everyone has their own style, their own approach. Special effects beyond this, if I wanted to add colors that were different, so if I make another layer above my flat colors, it will still be a clipping mask, but I'm going to call this full spectrum. And this, I'm not going to like too much, but it's when you do kind of full color theory painting. So if I add orange into my shadows on the tunic, and I'll set this, just at normal, not to lighten or to darken. But I want to add some orange into the greens as its complement, or some reds as its complement. Kind of give some rusty spots to his cloak. And then maybe mix between those colors. Maybe throw some purple in there. Because I'm a painter and I like these kind of color combinations. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You're allowed to do that in digital coloring. It's just no longer duotone coloring. It's what's called full spectrum coloring. And with simple line work, that can work really well. But when you have complex line work and complicated full spectrum coloring, it gets to be too much. There's too many accents. There's too many variations to everything. And it becomes distracting, like putting yellows and purples and pinks in the skin. That's why I always put them on a separate layer, so they can be worked with individually. It's still a clipping mask, so it still keeps me from coloring in the wrong, outside into the blank space. And that's nice. Now with this, you can do kind of washes of color over everything. And it can be a way of finishing off. So full spectrum. There you go. Kind of cool. You'll see a lot of webcomics that use it, but the ones that do mostly really keep simple line work, kind of like this. And then full spectrum is just kind of a nice way of rounding it out, especially if you're an artist that really likes to use color. Okay, so big differences. So that's full spectrum. Now for special effects that go above the ink line. So for this, I'm going to turn on the gray background. And these are what are called color holds. Now the easiest color hold to do is to just unlock your vector inks and then add layer styles by double clicking and adding a color overlay to it. So instead of a black line, let's make it kind of a reddish brown. Pretty dark still, but not black. And you'll see the difference there. You see the difference on gray, you'll see the difference on black, and you'll see especially the difference on white. So that's the simplest kind of color hold, to replace your black with something else. But you can do more, like a gradient overlay, which can be really effective depending on how you use it. Along with the color, you can add a gradient, and you can set it to multiply or to overlay, or you can even use a color gradient. And if you make your color overlay a little less opaque, that can be really dramatic. So I'm going to set this to normal. You'll see that. It goes from orange to kind of purple. I can decide how extreme to make that. It's just like when we were coloring our logos. And then I'll put the color overlay on top of that, just subtly. And maybe instead of the orange at the top of my gradient, I want it to be more like a green. So I'm going to use the color picker, pick like a light green. And maybe even add a color in the middle, because I liked that orange. I just don't like it at the edge of the leaf. Yeah. And that actually is a really nice effect. It really adds dimension to it just by replacing the black ink lines, which are still a vector and still completely have all the properties of the smart layer. And I can play with that overall opacity of those effects too.